All right, we'll say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning. Share to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Cheshvan, Steve and Terry Zinn, in loving memory of Steve's father, Albert Zinn, Bunim Tzvi Ben Chaim Zichron Levrach, on the occasion of his 20th yard site. Our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Ayal and Sarah Steinberg, in the schus of a continued refuah shalema for Shulamis Chana Bas Susha. And our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Tali and Michelle Strum, in creation of Tali's grandmother's 28th yard site, Esther Bas David Zichron Livracha. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshama Sav Aliyah, all the families in Nechama, all those who need Rafu Shavon together with Kol Chol Yisrael and Chalish Baruch, we should continue to shower Besoros Tovos upon all of Klal Yisrael. With that, let us begin. Today's Daf is Daf Samech. We are picking up Emir Hashem. On Nun Tesam base 59b, Rabbi Yossi Ki Gamar Gzeira Shava, which is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 13 lines up from the bottom. So let's remember, just to reorient ourselves for a moment. If you remember again, we had an interesting machlokes. The Torah said that halacha l'maisa, when Shlomo HaMelech built the Beis Hamikdash and built the Mizbeach, so the Gemara says that, or the Torah says that Bayomahu, on that particular day, he went ahead and he was Mekadesh. The pasuk says, Bayomahu Kidesh HaMelech es toch hachatzer asher lifnei Beis Hashem. So literally the pasuk says that on the day that Shlomo HaMelech consecrated the Beis Hamikdash, he sanctified the actual floor of the Beis Hamikdash. Okay, so the Gemara says that halacha l'maisa is machlokes. Is it literal or is it not literal? So if you understand that it was literal, it means that the Mizbeach that Shlomo HaMelech had built was too small to accommodate the sheer volume of sacrificial service, and therefore they had to go ahead and actually shecht karbanos on the floor. The other opinion says, no, that's not what it means. What it means is, when it says the Mizbeach was too small, it's a metaphor, or a euphemism, I should say, for whose Mizbeach was too small? Moshe Rabbeinu's Mizbeach was too small, and therefore Shlomo built a new Mizbeach to accommodate the new level of carbonic volume. Why not just say that straight out? Because it wouldn't have been nice to explicitly say that Moshe Rabbeinu's Mizbeach was too small. So it uses, remember again, you use the midget metaphor just to indicate to us that sometimes again you like to say something not in a straight out fashion, but a little bit of a veiled fashion. Okay, so we'll say that's our ongoing machlokes over here. So the Gemara said Rabbi Yossi ki Gomer Gzeira Shava begova hu de Gomer. So Rabbi Yossi, when he understands this Gzeira Shava, because let's remember again, what was the Gzeira Shava between? And again in yesterday's daf, a Gzeira Shava between the Beis Hamikdash, the Beis Hamikdash of Yecheskel, and the Mishkan of Moshe Rabbeinu. So remember again, we saw also this machlokes is the vision of Yecheskel, speaking about the second Beis Hamikdash, the third Beis Hamikdash. Let's go with the idea right now that it's second Beis Hamikdash, and therefore let's go back to Rabbi Yossi ki Gomer Gzeira Shava. When Rabbi Yossi understands his Gzeira Shava, begofahu de Gomer, he's ultimately understanding it to apply to the height of the Mizbeach. The Sanya, because we learned the Shalosh Amos Komaso Dvarim Kichsavan Div Rabbi Huda. So also when the pasuk says, just to read to you the pasuk in its entirety, Vasisas hamizbeach asay shitim, you shall make the mizbeach out of acacia wood, chamesh amos arech, 5 amos in length, the chamesh amos rocha, 5 amos in width, ravua yamzech for shalosh amos kamaso, and 3 amos in height. Most remember again, just also to get our terms, what Moshe Rabbeinu built was called the Mizbeach HaNechoshes. That's the exterior Mizbeach that was used for animal sacrifice. What Shlomo HaMelech built was called the Mizbeach HaVanim. By the way, now these pieces of information come together. Why was it called Mizbeach HaVanim? Why was it called that? Because you remember again, a couple of days ago, we spoke about how the Mizbeach itself was actually formed with the smooth stones, right? And then the pitch, tar, what was the third ingredient? Pitch, tar, lime and plaster, right? Pitch tar is one thing, right? Pitch or tar, lime, plaster, right? Combination, I'm sorry? Molten lead, thank you, right? Poured together over the stones to form that comprehensive thing. So interestingly enough, so remember, so the pasuk says over here, by the Mizbeach HaNechoshes, these are the dimensions. Shalos Amos Kamaso. Tvarim Kichsam de Rabbi Huda. Rabbi Huda says, quite literally, it's as it's stated. Rabbi Yossi says like this, Ne'emar kan Ravua, it says over here, It says over here, ultimately again, by the mizbeach, ultimately this mizbeach achitzon, the outer mizbeach that Moshe Rabbeinu built, ravua, that is square. V'ne'amar lahalon, and ultimately again it says by the mizbeach hapnimi. This is the ketoras mizbeach of Moshe, ravua, square. Ma lahalon. Now, also listen to this, very interesting. Ma lahalon govho pi shnayim ke'arko, just like by the mizbeach haketoras. Mizbeach haketoras. Ultimately, the height is 2 times the length. Afkan, so too by the mizbeach hachitzon, ka'afkan pishnaim ka'arko. So too by the outer mizbeach. Ultimately, again, the height. Right, mala gofo pishnaim ka'arko. So the height is twice the width, twice the length. So too by the mizbeach hachitzon, the height is twice the length, and therefore, ultimately, again, that would make the mizbeach hachitzon 10 amos in height. Okay, so I'm Rabbi Yehuda. I'm Rabbi Yehuda. This good parentheses. Efshar. We'll say here's the problem. Here's the problem. If the mizbeach is 10 amos in height, right? So that means the coin is sitting on top of the mizbeach 10 amos in height. Efshar coin omed al gabi mizbeach va'avoda biyado v'chala amrono somi b'chutz. We'll say if that's the case, interestingly enough, then Allah said that would mean that when in the Mishkan, when the Kohen was on top of the Mizbeach, he was standing above the curtains which surrounded the Mishkan, which then would mean that everyone would see the Kohen doing the Avodah. So I'll just point out something very interesting. So you'll say to yourself, so what? So what? So what's fascinating, remember again, is one of the elements that is so core and pivotal to the concept of avoda in the Mishkan and in the Beis Hamikdash as well is tznius, is a sense of modesty, a sense of privacy. That's why, right, if you think about this, the holiest day of the year on Yom Kippur, the holiest avoda, Kodesh HaKadoshim, Holy of Holies, yet amazingly enough, who sees it? Who sees it? No one sees it. Which, if you think about it, is the strangest thing in the world, right? Shouldn't this be like on a Mikdash Jumbotron? You know, like everybody should see this, right? This is the most inspiring thing in the world. But Elamai, there's a very important musar that sometimes the most dramatic spiritual feats should happen in a modest, unassuming, non-public way. It is natural for people to want to publicize their spiritual accomplishments. And by the way, there is a place for publicizing your spiritual accomplishments as well, right? Because remember, again, if you say, this comes up a lot, this comes up a lot in tzedakah, right? Tzedakah has these two competing motifs. On one hand, there's the highest level of tzedakah is to give in private, right? To give b'tzina, that no one knows about it. But there's a competing value. What's the competing value? Dafka, to make sure that your tzedakah is public and well known. Why? Because it encourages other people to give. And by the way, this in general is the dynamic by spirituality. That on one hand, I'm supposed to be private and supposed to be tzanua, modest in my spiritual accomplishments, but I also have to figure out when, by sharing those very things, I could encourage others to do the same. You know where this comes out? Okay, there's many examples of this. But I would say, for example, a siyum, right? The reason why a siyum is so incredibly important. Because what does a siyum do? We all know this. We've all been to siyumim. What does a siyum do? How do you feel when you leave a siyum? Don't say buzzed, right? How do you feel when you leave? Right? You feel like I'm ready. Like give me Gemara. Give me Gemara, right? I'm absolutely ready to do this, right? I'm ready to accomplish. That's the power. That's the power of these things. So I just want to point out this notion of engaging in spiritual activity in a more modest and non-public way ultimately comes from the Beis Hamikdash. So the idea is everything that happened for the Kohen did was done in private. So therefore the Gemara says, here's the problem. If the Mizbeach, now we're talking about the Mishkan now, if the Mizbeach was really 10 amos high, that would mean that when the Kohen was on top of the Mizbeach, everybody could see him on the outside. Why? Because the Pasuk says, Ma Mishkan Yud Amos, Af Mizbeach Yud Amos, V'omer. I'm sorry. So before we go on to that, so here's the problem. If the Mizbeach is 10 amos high, then Bepashas, everybody can see him. So the Gemara says, don't worry. Yomi says, no, don't worry. Ma Mishkan Yud Amos, af mizbeach yud amos. Va'omer kilayim chamesh esrei ama, top of samach, ama ala kasef. So we'll say no problem, because at the end of the day, actually the curtains were 15 amos tall. 15 amos tall, and therefore halacha l'maisa, it's okay, because even when the coin was standing on the mizbeach, ultimately again there was another 5 amma of curtain height above him. The Gemara says 1 second. Here's the problem. Umat Talmud lomar hey amos. But why does the pasuk seem to indicate that it's 5 amos? Because the pasuk says orach hachatzer mea ba'ama v'rochav chamishim v'chamishim v'koma chamesh amos sheish mashazar. The problem is the pasuk seems to say that the height of the curtains was 5 amos. So how do you reconcile? That's very interesting. Misvas mizbeach ulamala. What it means is when measuring from the top of the mizbeach and above, the curtains were 5 amos. So then I will say, so really the total height of the curtains was 15 amos. When measuring from the top of the mizbeach, it was 5 amos. And therefore it turns out that halacha l'maisa, the kohen did have privacy even when doing the avodah. Ma Talmud lomar. So we'll say Samach Hamdav, 68 second line now from the top. Uma Talmud lomar the shalosh amos komaso misvafs sovev ulamalo. So we'll say, so now this is transitioning out to the mizbeach hakitoras, the incense altar. So when it comes to the incense altar, the pasuk says, right, this is the what we call mizbeach hakitoras, mizbeach hazahav, the golden altar, the incense altar, the much smaller altar inside of the heichal, inside of the Beis Hamikdash itself. So, what does the pasuk mean when it says v'shalosh amos misvas sovev ulamalo? That the mizbeach was 3 amos in height. Misvas sovev. Ultimately, and I will say now the sovev we're going to see there was like a band around the mizbeach ulamalo and above. Rabbi Yehuda, listen to this. Rabbi Yehuda, if you look at Rashi, by the way, Rashi says, Misvas sovev ulamala, al makom hakronos ulamata himenu vav amos, v'gova karen amo. Fine. So Mar says like this. Rabbi Yehuda, ki gamer gzeira shava berach b'hu de gamer. When Rabbi Yehuda learns the gzeira shava, he's learning the gzeira shava much more to refer to the width. Rabbi Yehuda, ha kamis chazi kohen. So I say here's the issue. According to Rabbi Yehuda still his height would have it that you could still see the kohen. Now, granted, some of the curtain did extend up, but you would still be able to see the kohen. Look at Rashi just a moment. With Rabbi Yehuda, it's in Rashi in the 3rd wide line. Nehi nami didvarm kich savan ha kamis chazi kohen hagovu shalosh ukelayim eina ela chamesh v'atzmo gimel amos. Nimtza rosho lemala minakelaim. In Rabbi Yehuda's model, who understands the pasuk a little bit more literally, although some of the kohen's body is shielded, pretty much you'd still be able to see his head above the curtains. So the Gemara says, not a problem. Nihi the kohen mischazi avoda de biyado lo mischazi. So this is very interesting. Rabbi Yehuda says, what's the avoda of the curtains? That you shouldn't see the avoda. But if you see the kohen's head, you see the kohen's head. It doesn't matter. The idea is that the avoda itself should be in a bit more of a private setting. Okay, beautiful. So Bishal Rabbi Yehuda, Hainu Dichsiv Kiddush. And so I will say, so now going back, remember this whole discussion started by Shlomo HaMelech. So the pasuk says that Shlomo HaMelech sanctified the floor. According to Rabbi Yehuda says Devarim Kich Saban, that it's literal. It's literal. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, this makes a lot of sense why the pasuk says that Rabbi Yehuda says Kiddush, that Shlomo HaMelech sanctified the Chatzar. Why did he sanctify the Chatzar? Because literally he was using the floor of the Beis Hamikdash to shecht karbanos. Take a look at Rashi, almost right across. B'shalom Rabbi Yehuda hanu d'chsiv kiddush hamelech estocha Chatzar shechutzrecha kol haritzpa lekadsha l'shem mizbeach u'kedushasa b'shira mincha. We'll get to that in just a moment. So again, according to Rabbi Yehuda, it makes sense that the pasuk says Kiddush, that Shlomo literally sanctified the ground, because that's what he did. He literally sanctified the floor of the Beis Hamikdash so that it could act as a mizbeach. Ella, the Rabbi Yossi, my Kiddush. I'll say, here's the issue, right? The pasuk does say Kiddush Hamelech as Tocha Chatzar. It says that he sanctified the floor. It really does say that. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, the pasuk makes a lot of sense, because essentially he was making the floor an extension of the mizbeach. But according to Rabbi Yossi, who says that, no, remember again, what is Rabbi Yossi? Rabbi Yossi says that when it says that the Mizbeach was too small, which Mizbeach was too small? The Mizbeach of Moshe, and that's why Shlomo built a new one to it. But what does it mean when it says that Shlomo sanctified the floor? What does that mean? Amazingly enough, my Kiddush, lahamid ba Mizbeach. It's beautiful. Ultimately, again, to put the Mizbeach there, that in order to place the Mizbeach on the ground of the Beis HaMikdash, what did you have to do? You had to sanctify the ground. Now which is interesting, by the way, of course, something unique that didn't happen by the Mishkan, right? Because remember, again, the Mishkan did not need what we'll call any soil sanctification, because by definition it was mobile, right? It never stayed, it wasn't supposed to stay in one place. The Beis HaMikdash, which ultimately, again, is stationary. We'll discuss just how stationary in just a little bit. Halacha l'maisa apparently required some type of soil sanctification. You had to sanctify the ground. So that's what it means that Shlomo was Mekadesh the Ritzpah. He was Mekadesh the ground upon which the Mizbeach was situated. Incredible. So Gemara says, Bishlam Rabbi Yossi Hanu Dichsev Katan. So according to Rabbi Yossi, ultimately, again, this is why the pasuk says Katan, that it was too small. Ultimately, because remember again, according to Rabbi Yossi, ultimately again, he's referring to the Mizbeach of Moshe Rabbeinu. Al Rabbi Huda my Katan, but according to Rabbi Huda, what is Katan? Rashi says, Rabbi Yossi Damer Shal Shlomo Gadol v'Shal Moshe Katan. So again, it makes sense to say that the Mizbeach was too small, because it's not referring to Shlomo's Mizbeach, rather it's referring ultimately to Moshe Rabbeinu's Mizbeach. So the Gemara says, Ella Rabbi Huda my Katan, but according to Rabbi Huda, ultimately again, what does it mean it was too small? Because we'll say, remember again, according to Rabbi Huda, Shlomo Melech effectively made the Mizbeach and the entire floor of Mizbeach. So what was too small? What was too small? So the Gemara says, Hachikam, that's what it means to say, Mizbeach avanim sha'asa Shlomo tachas Mizbeach hanachoshes katan haba. It means to say like this, that even though Shlomo HaMelech constructed a new Mizbeach, the new Mizbeach that Shlomo, the Mizbeach Avarim that Shlomo constructed, instead of the Mizbeach hanachoshes of Moshe, was still too small. And therefore, what do they have to do? They have to sanctify the floor as well to serve as an extension of the Mizbeach. Incredible. So the Gemara says, "B'may pligi." So at the end of the day, what is the machlokes over here? So this is very interesting. So what? Yeah. Okay. So Rashi goes through this a little bit more as well, but fine. We'll just go weiter. Rashi says, "B'may pligi." What are they arguing about? So Marsav Rabbi Huda says like this: "Danin chutz michutz ve'in danin chutz mipnim." Rabbi Huda says that halacha l'maisa, we want to learn out chutz from chutz, which means we will learn out the halachos of the Mizbeach of Shlomo HaMelech from the Mizbeach ultimately again of Moshe Rabbeinu, because we would rather go ahead and make a gzeira shava ultimately again between two outer mizbechos, chutz michutz, ve'in danin chutz mipnim, and we're not going to ultimately again learn out a din of the outer mizbeach from a din of the inner mizbeach, mizbeach hakitoras. Marsa Rabbi Yossi says, danin kli mikli, ve'in danin kli mibinyan. So we'll say this is actually very interesting. It's very interesting. Rabbi Yossi says we would rather go ahead and learn out the halachos of one kli from another kli. Now, here's what I want to point out to you. We have been very much focused on this idea that there are two mizbechos, right? Two altars. The mizbech hachitzon, an outer mizbech, ultimately again, which is for animal sacrifice, and an inner mizbech, mizbech kitoras. Now, the mizbech kitoras was pretty much the same thing by the Mishkan and by the Beis HaMikdash. What fundamentally changed was the outer mizbech. Right? The outer Mizbeach of Moshe Rabbeinu was much smaller than the Mizbeach ultimately of Shlomo Melech. Furthermore, the outer Mizbeach of Moshe was what's called the Copper Mizbeach. By Shlomo Melech, it was called Mizbeach Avanim. There's another very important distinction as well. The Mizbeach of Moshe Rabbeinu, the Mizbeach Hanachoshes, right? The outer Mizbeach, what we call Mizbeach of Karbanos, was mobile, right? Because everything in the Mishkan was mobile. On the other hand, the Mizbeach of Shlomo obviously was stationary, it was not mobile. We'll say, once something is mobile, what does that make it? In halacha, that gives it the classification of a kli, right? In halacha, remember again, something can be categorized in multiple categories, but for our purpose, there are two primary categories, which is kli and karka, right? But what makes the difference in kli and karka? Kli is mobile, karka is stationary. So what's interesting over here is, fascinatingly enough, the Mizbeach HaNechoshes, the Copper Mizbeach, the outer Mizbeach, the altar, right, the carbonic Mizbeach of Moshe Rabbeinu was a kli. It was a kli because it was mobile. So watch this. So on one hand, Rabbi Huda says, I'd rather go, I've done in chutz michutz, ve'in done in chutz mipnim. let's learn out one outer mizbeach from another outer mizbeach and not compare the outer mizbeach to the inner mizbeach. On the other hand, Rabbi Yossi says, Mar Savar done in kli mikli, vein done in kli mibinyan. We also remember again, the common denominator between the mizbechos of Moshe Rabbeinu or the outer mizbeach of Moshe Rabbeinu and the mizbeach hakitoras, because remember, mizbeach hakitoras in both Batei Mikdash has the status of a kli, right? Why? Because it's movable, because it's small, and not that it was moved, but can be moved. So there's Rabbi Yossi says we'd rather learn out kli mi kli, one kli from another kli, ve'in done in kli mi binyan, and not kli from a binyan. Take a look at Rashi. Kli mi kli mizbeach hanachoshes va'zahav kelim heim. So remember again, by the Mishkan, both the mizbeach hanachoshes, which is the outer mizbeach, and the mizbeach hazav, which is the inner mizbeach, ultimately, again, are both kelim. So therefore, in Rabbi Yossi's model, this was, we just had this point in the beginning of the daf. Rabbi Yossi will rather learn out his gzeira shava, ultimately, again, from like items. Kli mi kli, so mizbeach hanachoshes from the mizbeach hazav. Amar Rava, mod Rabbi Yehuda bedamim. Rabbi Yossi, it's very interesting as follows. As much as Rabbi Yehuda said that halacha l'maisa, right, the entire Azara ultimately again was Makudash, right? That Shlomo HaMelech was makdish the ritzpah, that he was makdish the floor, and therefore you could shecht karbanos even on the floor of the mikdash. Even Rabbi Yehuda agrees that when it comes to blood applications must be done on the mizbeach itself. So this is very interesting, I will say, that even if you hold that somehow there's a mechanism to sanctify the floor of the mikdash itself to act as an extension of the mizbeach, that is only for shchita, not for zrika. Zrika itself must be done on the mizbeach. The sign of both sides of the Gemara we had. The sign of Rabbi Yehuda says, we saw this Gemara before. Kos echad hayim memalimi damataroves v'shochvo agav mizbeach. So what's like carbon pesach, right? After they finish shechting all of the carbon pesachs, what would they do? The kohen would take remember, the blood had pooled up until their knees. So what would the kohen do? He would take a cup of collective blood and then throw that on the mizbeach. And what did that do? So the Gemara says, Shim yishbach damoshal achas mehen nimsa zemach shiro. Because in the event that the blood of one of the karbanos did not have proper zrika and fell on the floor, this act of combined zrika would essentially take care of all of the collective karbanos. So what do you see from here? Because if Rabbi Yehuda really felt that when we sanctify the floor, it becomes like the mizbeach, that means that what? When the blood falls on the floor, that's effectively a zrika. And therefore it should work. So the fact that even Rabbi Yehuda agrees that at the end of the carbon pesach process, you would take a cup of collective blood, pour that on the mizbeach, that shows that even if you hold that shchita could occur on the floor, right? That shchita, in other words, that the floor is like an extension ultimately of the mizbeach, zrika must be done on the mizbeach itself. The Dilma, 1 second, hold up. That's not a raya. The Dilma mishum de kasav shvicha mikoach adam ba'inan. 1 second. Maybe Rabbi Yehuda requires you to lift up the cup of collective blood poured on the mizbeach because he holds that zrika requires koach adam. What's koach adam? In other words, zrika requires intentional effort, as opposed to just dropping blood. Because also remember again, for example, here's an interesting application of this. Let's say the kohen is holding the blood, he trips, and the blood ends up spilling on the mizbeach. So that's not necessarily zrika, right? Why? Because zrika requires koach adam, requires intentional effort. So maybe halacha l'maisa, the reason why Rabbi Yehuda holds that you have to pick up a cup of collective blood is because the blood application requires intentionality. And that didn't happen if the blood just spilled on the ground. Well, if that's the case, if that's the case, no problem. Then what should you do? Pick up a collective cup of blood and what? Pour it back on the floor. But this time, pour it back with intentionality. That should be enough. The fact that you have to pour it on the mizbeach indicates to us that zrika must be done on the mizbeach. Maybe not. In other words, I will say, even if Rabbi Yehuda would say that zrika can be done on the ground, everyone will agree that what's the mitzvah min hamuvchar, what's the ideal way to do it? That you do it on the mizbeach. Right? So it's not a raya over here. So it's just because at the end of the process of carbon pesach, that Allah we take a cup of collective blood and pour it on the mizbeach is not necessarily a raya that you can't do zrika on the ground according to Rabbi Yehuda, because Rabbi Yehuda might just be telling us this is the mitzvah min hamuvchar, this is the ideal way to do it. Okay. Interesting. So I just want to point out before. So now that kind of ends this discussion. So just to point out over here that we have a historical machlokes about what exactly happened the day that Shlomo, or over the days of consecration. Did Shlomo HaMelech actually consecrate the floor of the mikdash itself to allow the floor of the mikdash to serve as an extension of the mizbeach? Is that what it means when it says that the mizbeach was too small? Or no, he didn't consecrate the floor. All carbonic service took place on top of the Mizbeach. And when it says that the Mizbeach was too small, that's ultimately a euphemism that the Mizbeach of Moshe was too small, and hence Shlomo HaMelech had to build a new one. So just an interesting historical machlokes. Incredible. Let's go back there. Rabbi Lazar. We'll say very, very interesting halacha over here. Mizbeach shenifkam. This is reminiscent of yesterday's daf as well. Mizbeach shenifkam. If the mizbeach is damaged, ein ochlin begino shiyari mincha. You can no longer eat the leftovers of the mincha offering. So we'll say. So remember again, mincha 101. What do you do with a carbon mincha? What does the kohen do? He takes a kamitza, right? Remember again, three middle fingers. Goes ahead, lifts up, shaves off the edges with his pinky and his thumb. That is offered on the mizbeach. After you offer Zan on the Mizbeach, the rest of the carbon is the Kohen's. It belongs to him. So now the Gemara says as follows. So now Rabbi Lazar says if the Mizbeach was damaged, the Kohen can't eat the rest of the Mincha in a state of when the Mizbeach itself is not whole, when the Mizbeach is damaged. Shneimar, va'achlu matzos eitz al Mizbeach. So it's very interesting because the pasuk says, "You shall eat the remnants of the carbon mincha." Literally, you'll eat it as matzos. Now, again, there are different types of carbon mincha, but the point over here is Kohen. You'll eat the carbon mincha eitz al mizbeach, by the mizbeach. Now, why does it say by the mizbeach? V'chi eitz al mizbeach achlua. So I don't understand. You don't have to eat the mincha by the mizbeach, right? You could go ahead. Rashi says over here, "V'chi eitz al mizbeach achlua." Follow kol ha'azara ksher lekach tivsiv b'mincha. So will say the halacha is you could eat the leftover mincha anywhere in the courtyard, anywhere in the Azara. So why does it say that you eat the mincha by the Mizbeach? Ela bizman shu shalim v'lo bizman shu chaser. Right? The Gemara says what eitz al Mizbeach means. Essentially you'll eat the mincha when the Mizbeach itself is intact. But when the Mizbeach is not intact, i.e. it has been damaged, halacha l'maisa, you can't eat the carbon mincha. Incredible. So ashkich on shi'ar mincha. So now I know this halacha by mincha. Kodshei kadoshim minalan. How do I know about kodshei kadoshim? Both said the same halacha applies to kodshei kadoshim. That halacha l'maisa, again, let's say, just to illustrate where this case could come up, when the kohen offered the carbon, the mizbeach was fully intact and whole. Then what happens? The mizbeach gets damaged. So now the kohen has the sacrificial meat. How do I know that I can't eat sacrificial meat if the mizbeach is damaged? To which the Gemara says, Amar Abaye Asya Midrasha Rabbi Yossi. It's the drasha Rabbi Yossi. What's the drasha? The Sanya Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi says, Gimel Dvarim Mishum Amud Beis Mishum Gimel Zakemim. So Rabbi Yossi says, ultimately, I learned three things from three elders. Okay? I'll share with you one of them. What's the one? Rabbi Shmuel says, So I'll say this is great. This is absolutely great. So Rabbi Shmuel says like this. One might have thought that you can go ahead and bring Meiser Sheni to Yerushalayim today and eat Meiser Sheni in a state of Kiddusha. Look at Rashi. Yochel Ya'ale Adam Meiser Sheni. Now, why would I think that? The kasavar, I'm reading Rashi now, second line from the top. The kasavar kidushas haaretz lo batla. Because we're both say if you hold that the kedusha of Eretz Yisrael is eternal, utzricha hafrashas meisus minatar. And I both say, now understand, if the kedusha of Eretz Yisrael is eternal, that means that what? That the produce has kedushas haaretz. The produce has kedushas Eretz Yisrael. Well, if the produce has kedushas Eretz Yisrael, that means there's a biblical obligation of trumas and maestros. Well, if there's trumas and maestros, then there's meiser sheni, and ultimately, again, I should have to bring it up to Yerushalayim. Right? That's what I would have thought. So Yochel Ya'ale Adam. Suppose we're going. Okay, let's. Yochel is so exciting. Yochel Ya'ale Adam meiser Yerushalayim. I might have thought that even today, without a Beis Hamikdash, I should be obligated to bring Meiser Sheni to Yerushalayim. Now again, on both sides, remember, if you hold that the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael is eternal, right? The kedusha of the land does not cease. I don't mean like in a hashkafic spiritual sense. We're talking in a halachic sense that Eretz Yisrael retains its kedusha for all eternity. There is a Beis Hamikdash, there isn't a Beis Hamikdash. It doesn't matter. The Eretz Yisrael has its kedusha. That means the produce ultimately again is Eretz Yisrael's sanctity, which means that the halachas of Trumas and Maasros apply even in the absence of a Beis Hamikdash, which would then mean Meiser Sheni, which is mine. I could eat it, but I have to eat it in Yerushalayim. So now I have an obligation to bring it up to Yerushalayim, even now, even without a Beis Hamikdash. That's what I would have thought. So the Gemara says, well, the truth is, I can make a kavachomer. What's the kavachomer? Here we go. Bechar ta'on havas makom. So on one hand, I will say Bechar. Right? What's our Bechar? Firstborn animal that you have to give to the Kohen. So Bechar requires, right, being brought to the Beis Hamikdash. Umaiser ta'on havas makom. Meiser Sheni also requires being brought to Yerushalayim. Ma Bechar ena ela b'fnei abayis. Just like Bechar only applies when there's a Beis Hamikdash, because it's in the sacrificial family. Af Meiser Sheni ela b'fnei abayis. So too Meiser Sheni only applies where there is a Beis Hamikdash. Incredible, that's the Kavachomer, and therefore we'll say it turns out that no, there's no din of bringing Meiser Sheni to Yerushalayim when there's no Beis Hamikdash. Hold up. That is not a fair comparison, because remember again, Bechar is a carbon. Bechar is a carbon. As much as the Kohen gets to eat the meat, at the end of the day, it requires Zrika, blood application, and sacrificial parts on the Mizbeach. So of course that only happens with a Beis Hamikdash. But yet, obviously, Meiser Sheni doesn't have any of that. See, even if Bechar does require a Beis Hamikdash, maybe Meiser Sheni does not, to which the Gemara says, Bikurim yochichu. No, Bikurim will prove, because it will say Bikurim, right? Bikurim, there's obviously no blood, Bikurim are first fruits. Obviously, there's no blood application by Bikurim. And yet, when is there mitzvah Bikurim? Only when there is a Beis Hamikdash. So I can say, just like Bikurim only applies when there's a Beis Hamikdash, so to Meiser Sheni only applies when there's a Beis Hamikdash. No, but Ma'ila Bikurim shekin tu'unin hanocha. Remember, Bikurim do require something. What do Bikurim require? Hanocha. The halacha is Bikurim are placed by the Mizbeach. So ultimately, again, of course, Bikurim require Beis Hamikdash. Meiser Sheni has no such hanocha requirement. Say Meiser Sheni should be obligated even in the absence of Beis Hamikdash. Shalomar, listen to this. Ve'aveisim shama olo seichem. So we'll say, so the pasuk says, Ve'aveisim shama olo seichem, v'zivcheichem, ve'es masro seichem, ve'es trumas yadchem, v'nidrechem, v'nidvosechem, u'bechoros bekarchem v'tzonachem. So we'll say, so the pasuk groups together all of these items. Now watch this. Makish, meiser lebechar. In the pasuk itself, the pasuk equates meiser, which I will say refers to all Shumas and Meisers. But for our purposes over here, we're referring Dafka to Meiser Sheni. It equates Meiser Sheni to Bechar. Ma Bechar ena ela b'fnei abayis. Ultimately, again, just like Bechar only applies where there's a Beis Hamikdash, Af Meiser ena ela b'fnei abayis. So to Meiser Sheni only applies ultimately when there is a Beis Hamikdash. Incredible. And therefore, there would be no contemporary obligation to bring Meiser Sheni to Yerushalayim. Gemara says, 1 second. V'nei hader dina. So why not go ahead and create, we'll say, a matzad? Ultimately, again, now what would the matzad be? The matzad is like a common denominator. What's the matzad? So Rashi points out over here, we would make a matzad between Bechar and Bikurim. And we would say, ultimately, again, just like Bechar and Bikurim are consumed in Yerushalayim and require a Beis Hamikdash, so too Meiser Sheni, which is in Yerushalayim, also requires a Beis Hamikdash. I'll tell you why. Because you can ask a pircha on this. What's the pircha? Here's the difference, I will say. Both Bechar and Bikurim have what we call it Tzad Mizbeach. They both interact with the Mizbeach. Bechar is ultimately, again, blood applications and sacrificial parts. Bikurim is the placement of the Bikurim by the Mizbeach, whereas Meiser Sheni doesn't have any Mizbeach interaction. So we'll say, to which the Gemara said, let's back up a little bit, right? Let's back up, because what is the principle that underlies this entire discussion? The principle that underlies this entire discussion is, what is the status of the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael? Right? Does Eretz Yisrael retain its biblical Kedusha in the absence of the Beis Hamikdash or not? That's, I will say, I just want to point out, there's two discussions that may not be interrelated. The two discussions are, is the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael eternal? That's number one. The Kedusha of the Solar is eternal, which would then mean, if it is, that means even in the absence of a Beis Hamikdash, all of the laws of Trumas and Maasros still apply, ultimately, again, biblically. So that's issue one. Issue number two is, what is the status of the Harabayas? Does the Harabayas retain its biblical Kedusha even without the Beis Hamikdash? Does it remain intact with or without the Beis Hamikdash? So so Kedusha Rishon, Kedusha Shai, Kedusha Asa Lavo. So in other words, both sides, and that has ramifications as well, which is, can you offer up karbanos on the Harabayas even in the absence of the Beis Hamikdash? If you hold that the area is sanctified, eternal sanctity, even without the structure, it could be that you could offer up karbanos. If you hold, however, again, the sanctity is only there when the structure is there, you can't offer up karbanos. So just, these are two machlokim. So here we go. Says the Gemara, my kasar. So what exactly do we hold? So the Gemara says, Ika savar, Kedusha Rishona, Kidsha L'Shaita, the Kidsha L'Asad level. So if we hold that halacha l'maisa, the first Kedusha ultimately, again, was sanctified for its time and sanctified for all eternity, which is another way of saying that the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael is eternal. Then afilu b'char nami. Then Rabbi say the truth is, I should have to bring b'char even without a Beis Hamikdash. Right? Halacha l'maisa, Rashi says over here, afilu b'char nami, afilu b'char yakriv v'yochav, the ha man the islay kedusha la'asid lavo, islay shemakriven afapi she'in bayis. So Rabbi says, so ultimately again, if you hold that halacha l'maisa, kedusha rishona, now it's interesting, by the way, Rashi understands over here that now this is talking about the Beis Hamikdash. So, because if you look at the Dir Master, Rashi says, ika savar kedusha rishona shal bayis. So Rashi says like this: if you hold that halacha l'maisa, when the first Beis Hamikdash was sanctified, the sanctity is eternal. If that's the case, then you should be able to bring, or obligated to bring, bachar now as well, because you could offer up bachar even in the absence of the Beis Hamikdash. V'ikasavar lo kisha la'asid lavo, and ultimately, again, if the sanctity of the Beis Hamikdash was not eternal, then what? Afilu bachar nami tibai. Then ultimately, again, even bachar is a shayla. Amravina li'olam kasabar lo kidsha. Both say in reality we paskin that halacha l'maisa. So we'll say, so again, the Gemara here is asking about the kedusha of the harabayis. Is the kedusha of the harabayis eternal or not eternal? If it's eternal, then you could offer up bachar. If it's not eternal, then we can't offer up bachar. So the Gemara says, Amravina li'olam kasabar lo kidsha. In reality, Ravina says we hold that the Kedusha of the Harabayis is only there when the Beis HaMikdash stands, and ultimately, again, if the Beis HaMikdash is not there, there is not temple sanctity. So the Gemara says, but what's the case? This is incredible. This is wild. What if you had the following case? You have a Bechor animal. The Bechor animal ultimately, again, was shechted, and the Zrika was done before the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. And then what happens? And then ultimately, again, then the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. So what ends up happening over here is, by the time you get to eat of the meat, the Beis HaMikdash is no longer there. The Beis HaMikdash is no longer there. So at the time of Shechita, the time of Zrika, Beis HaMikdash was there. Then by the time I get to consumption, Beis HaMikdash is no longer there. What is the halacha? What's the halacha in such a situation like this? V'adayin b'sara kayim. So we'll say, now the Basra will say, by the way, I just want to point out what an incredible Musar HaSkil. Incredible Musar HaSkil is, life could change in the blink of an eye. And sometimes the things that we have in one moment, we do not have in the very next moment of life. And ultimately, we like to think that change is gradual, change takes time, and sometimes it does. But sometimes, especially in the world of loss, the things that you treasure and the things that you love and the things that you have in one moment could chas v'shalom be gone in the next. Which is why, again, we have to take the time to mamish, first of all, treasure and appreciate the special people and the special things that we have in life. Say the things that need to be said to the people we love, for we never know what the next moment brings. So therefore, the Gemara says, so here, this person went ahead and shechted the carbon, did the zrika on the mizbeach, and then the very next moment it was destroyed. The sacrificial meat is still in existence. So what do? So the Gemara says, V'iskish b'sar l'damo. We compared the meat of the bachar to the dam of the bachar. Ma damo b'mizbeach, af b'saro b'mizbeach. Just like the blood requires mizbeach, Mizbeach, so too the meat requires the Mizbeach. As I said, this goes back to what we were saying before. And therefore, halacha l'maisa, if the Mizbeach is not in existence at the time of meat consumption, you cannot eat the sacrificial meat. V'asi meiser v'yalach mi bechar. And therefore, we'll say we come and we learn out meiser sheni from bechar, meaning what? Just like bechar requires ultimately again a Mizbeach, both by zerika as well as by achila, by consumption of the sacrificial meat, so too meiser sheni requires a Mizbeach as well. And the absence of a Mizbeach by meiser sheni says you don't bring meiser sheni. Right, if there's no Mizbeach, you don't bring Meiser Sheni. The Gemara says, 1 second. V'chidavar halome behekesh. This keeps coming up. This is incredible. It keeps coming up in Zevachim. V'chidavar halome behekesh. Chozon al behekesh for 1 second. Can something itself that is learned out from a hekesh be the source of another hekesh? Shabbos says, if you remember again, we've seen this concept before. If you learn out B from A as a result of a hekesh, could B then go ahead and serve as the source ultimately again for C? We're going to stop over here for today, but just understand. So we're stopping a little bit in the midst of a machlokes over here, which is that halacha l'maisa. Remember, how was this all introduced? If you have a mizbeach, I shechted a carbon. I went ahead and I did zrika. Then the mizbeach was damaged. Can you go ahead and eat sacrificial meat when the mizbeach was damaged? That's the overarching question. That then led to a segue. That then led ultimately again to a little bit of a detour. Ultimately again, in the absence of a mizbeach, what can you do? Which then led to the more global discussion about the nature of the sanctity of Eretz Yisrael, the nature of the sanctity of Harabayis, and Meretz Hashem to be continued tomorrow. Shkayach, everyone. All right, Chavra Zoom, have a great day.
What's the problem with learning?
Eretz Yisrael, Chavra, Mamish. This is your sugya. This is your sugya. What is the nature of the Kiddush of Eretz Yisrael? Incredible.
They're all in the same pasuk, so why can't you make it? They're all in